Hello again folks, and welcome to another screencast on biomechanics, and this is the second in our biomechanical principles, and this particular screencast is going to be discussing force. Force is essential to motion, and we essentially, as an overview of force, we have two types of force that can be created. On the left here we have internal force, so that's the force generated by your skeletal muscles to help move your body or move certain joints. So when the muscle contracts, it creates a force and the joint moves. And the particular focus we're going to look at today is more on the external forces. So these are forces from outside of the body, and these can be things such as weight, friction, ground reaction and air resistance. We're going to come on to these later on and how to draw these types of force onto what we call free body diagrams. But initially, to begin with, we're going to look at the effects of force and give you some examples to work with that, because the exam will ask you for examples in relation to the effects of force. So we have 5 different effects of force on a body. Remember, a body is an object or a person. So if we're thinking about a ball, these things can affect the ball itself in terms of force. So force itself can move the body, it can create motion, that's one effect. It can accelerate that ball, is the second effect, or it can decelerate that ball or slow it down, is a third effect. It can change the direction that the ball is travelling, so another force can act upon the ball and it may change direction. And it can change the shape of a body, so if we put enough force into the ball, it may alter the shape of that ball. What I'd like you to do to start with for your notes is to think about a simple football penalty shootout. Now, if you're not familiar with football, please go onto YouTube, find a penalty shootout online, and what I want you to watch is what happens to the ball. So we're looking at the ball as the body. Can you write down the 5 effects of force on that ball? And to do that, what I'd like you to do is to think about making a chart, such as this. So you can pause this screen, draw yourself a very simple chart, and look at the effects on the left. So what has happened to the ball to create motion? Give an example from the penalty shootout. Where has the ball accelerated, and how did it do that? Give an example from the penalty shootout. Where did the ball decelerate? Again, give an example from that, the penalty shootout. Anywhere where it changed direction, anywhere where the ball itself changed shape, you think, due to force being applied for it. Alright, so that gives you a summary of an outline of force and its basic effects, what I like to call the simplistic nature of force in this OCR A-Level PE exam. Moving on then, and the next concept we're going to look at is net force. Now, net force is just the sum of all forces acting on a body. So it's the calculation of all the different forces acting on a person or acting on an object. Sometimes in the exam you might see that as resultant force, but they mean the same thing: net force, resultant force. And as you'll see in this screencast, we can draw diagrams to show how much force is being applied by the external forces in order to calculate net force. We have a concept also that's in your exam called balanced or unbalanced forces. And you need to understand how this works. It's fairly straightforward, but it can catch people out. So we're looking at the overall total of the force, so net force. So if net force equals 0, the body or the object doesn't move. It's stationary. Okay, so net force equals 0, the body or the object is stationary, and the reason for that is because the forces are equal in size and direction. However, if net force becomes anything other than 0, then that object must be moving, or the body must be moving. And we call that unbalanced forces. So if net force is 0, that's a balanced force. if net force is 1 or -1 or +2 or -2, etc., that's an unbalanced force because it's not 0. Generally speaking, if the net force is a positive number, the body itself will accelerate. So if a ball has been hit, the net force might be 2, for example, +2, the body will be accelerating if it is a positive number. However, if the net force is negative, the body will then decelerate. So it's important to understand the numbers that are being used here. So net force or balanced force is 0. Any other numbers that are positive is acceleration in force. Any other numbers that are negative is deceleration in force. You'll always need examples for the exam questions. So here's a good example of balanced force. So if the net force is 0, remember, balanced force. If we have 2 rugby packs going into a scrum and they don't move, let's say they're exactly the same weight, completely motionless, the pack itself isn't moving, the scrum isn't moving, the net force could be 0 because you could argue that the scrum isn't moving anywhere, the forces are equal from both sides or both teams. A good example of an unbalanced force might be the ball as it's being thrown in a netball game. So we're purely looking at the ball only. If I throw the ball forwards, it might accelerate. And so its net force might be +1 because the ball is moving forwards. If I throw that ball towards somebody else and air resistance starts to slow that ball down, that might give a resultant force or net force of -1 because the ball is starting to slow down. So in both occasions there you could have an unbalanced force looking at a ball that's being passed. Okay, so far we've gone through the 5 effects of force and we've gone through resultant force or net force, which includes balanced and unbalanced forces. So you should have covered those things so far. We're now going to look at what we call vertical and horizontal forces. And for this, you'll need to write down the definitions of these and draw diagrams to match how to put them onto a diagram, because this is where you're going to be tested. You're going to be tested not only in definitions, but in how to apply this stuff onto a drawn diagram. So the 2 blue squares coming up now are what we call vertical forces. So these are weight and reaction. They are vertical forces. And the 2 orange boxes you see on the screen are what we call horizontal forces. Some exams questions will ask for just vertical forces. Some exam questions will ask for just horizontal forces. Most exam questions in terms of force diagrams will ask for all the forces. So that is all 4 forces that you see on this screen. We will come to this later on and I'll show an example of it. Let's look at vertical force number 1, weight, first. So let's get our definitions first. So weight is the gravitational pull that exerts or puts pressure on a body. So it pulls something to the ground. That is weight. We can calculate weight by the following. Weight in newtons is mass, measured in kilograms, multiplied by acceleration due to gravity, measured in meters per second. So for your definitions for the exams, you're allowed a written definition or the calculation definition. This is the most important thing to understand. When we draw diagrams of performers or objects, we use the most simplistic form possible, because in an exam you won't have enough time to draw a very detailed sketch of something. You just quickly need to draw a simple diagram of a person or an object so you can label it. You haven't got enough time. So what I would suggest to you is use something like a stickman diagram if you're drawing a person, or a very simplistic object if you're drawing a ball or a shuttlecock or a javelin or something like this. So on the right hand side of the screen I have a stickman person jumping upwards. I've tried to get it as simple as possible for you. If I wish to draw weight onto that stickman diagram, because I'm going to need to know how to do that for the exam, what happens is you draw a vertical arrow downwards from the centre of mass of the person. So I'm looking at my stickman now and I'm thinking just about there is the centre of mass, and I draw a line downwards. It must have an arrow at the bottom of it, so it's going down, and it also must have a W underneath it, and that signifies that you have drawn the weight line. The line must touch the floor. Okay, so it goes from the centre of mass down to the floor on your diagram. So that's weight. Please make sure you've drawn that diagram into your notes so you understand how to draw a weight line in the future. The second vertical force is called reaction. And reaction, as we well know from Newton's laws, is the equal and opposite force exerted onto a body, so an object or a person, in response to the action force placed upon it. It relates to Newton's third law of motion, and again we measure it in newtons. If you have two bodies in contact, so a foot hitting the floor, reaction is always present. Okay, so it's always there when you've got two bodies that come into contact together. So again, looking at my stickman diagram of someone who is jumping upwards, reaction is always opposite to weight in terms of the way you draw it. However, reaction is always drawn from the point of contact of the object to the floor, or the person to the floor. So for example, on my stickman diagram you can clearly see that one of the feet are touching the floor, and it's from that point you draw your reaction line, and this time the reaction line goes upwards. Okay, so the reaction line will go from the point of the individual's foot, or the point of contact, and will go upwards with an arrow pointing upwards as well, and we'll have an R for reaction at the top. Now you might look at that line and think, Christ, that's a long line, but we'll come to that in the next slide. So just to recap, weight goes from the centre of mass down to the ground with a W, and reaction goes from the point of contact up with an R above it. Now, as I just mentioned, my R line previously was longer than the weight line, and now we're going to come to that. So we put a little title in your notes called length of lines, and if you're asked to draw vertical forces, you will just draw reaction and weight, and so your diagram might look like this. So I've got a purple line for weight going down to the floor from the centre of mass with a W, and I've got my reaction line going up from the foot or the point of contact with an R above it. If my diagram looks like that, what that actually means is reaction is the same as weight. And so we have to write W equals R, weight equals reaction. That means the performer doesn't move because the forces are the same. Remember what we said earlier on, the force is balanced. The object or the person will not move. But we know from that diagram, because I've already told you, the person is jumping upwards. And so because the person is jumping upwards, one of the forces needs to be greater than the other. And in this sense, if I want to go upwards, the reaction line has to be longer than the weight line, because weight is pulling me down, but I'm actually jumping upwards. So reaction would be longer than weight, and that means what you need to write beside your diagram is that reaction is greater than weight. So there's a second important note here when you're drawing your diagrams. What I've done on both of these diagrams is put a little calculation by the side of my diagram, and the reason for that is just in case the examiner cannot see the difference between your two lines, you have made it very clear that reaction is greater than weight by writing it by the side, or that weight equals reaction. Write it by the side. It's a very important tip. Okay, so that's vertical forces. Let's move on to horizontal forces. Let's start with air resistance. Air resistance is a force that opposes motion through the air. So as I travel forwards, I'm going to meet air resistance in some way. If a ball moves forwards, it will meet air resistance. We call that a form of fluid friction, and you'll meet fluid friction in year 2. We measure air resistance in newtons still, so N. However, because it is a horizontal force, on a diagram, it doesn't go up or down, it goes in a horizontal plane. And it goes in a horizontal arrow going away from the direction of travel. So if I was running forwards, the arrow goes opposite to the direction that I'm running, and it runs from the centre of mass. So it's the same as weight. It goes from the centre of mass in the opposite direction of which I'm running. So it would look like this. So air resistance, if I was running to the right, or if the stickman diagram is running to the right, the air resistance line goes the opposite way. Please make sure you've drawn this diagram in your notes so you understand how to put the air resistance line on it. Added to that with air resistance, you also need to understand that there are different factors that affect how air resistance works. So we'll go from left to right, starting with the red box first. Velocity is a factor that affects air resistance. Velocity essentially is how fast an object goes. So if an object is going very, very fast, you'll get more air resistance. There's nothing we can do about that as sports people, because generally we often want to go faster, and so we can't change that factor. So if you think about a sprinter, 100 metre sprinter, their ideal aim is to go as fast as they can. They're always going to encounter the factor of velocity in terms of air resistance. In the purple box it says shape. This is the second factor that affects air resistance. If we can make a shape aerodynamic, so think about the helmet of a track cyclist. It's what we call an aerofoil shape. It's very smooth, like a teardrop. Somebody once called it a whale. If you draw it as a simple diagram, it looks like a whale. If I make a shape more aerodynamic, I can reduce air resistance, and therefore I can make myself travel faster. If you think about swimmers, when they go for an underwater period at the start after they dive in, they raise their arms above their body and do a flutter kick. They're becoming streamlined, so as low to the water as they can be, and that will also minimise air resistance, or in their case it will minimise drag, because we're talking about water. If you think about a sprinter, they will lower their body down to minimise air resistance. They're streamlining. So shape is something we can change to make something go faster or slower with air resistance. The blue box says front cross-sectional area. If we lower the front cross-sectional area, air resistance will be reduced, and therefore we can go faster. So again, with all these factors, we're trying to reduce them so we can go faster. Good example of that is someone on a bike. If a cyclist is an average person on a bike, or maybe someone who's never cycled before, they might hold their body quite upright when cycling and holding onto the handlebars. Where their body is so upright, That creates lots of air resistance because you've got a large surface area above the bike, and it slows the person down when they're cycling if there's lots of wind against them. However, if you watch a track cyclist or an elite cyclist, maybe on the Tour de France, they will have their body very low to the handlebars, and they have reduced their cross-sectional area. They've become much lower to the handlebars. There's less air resistance to hit them, and so therefore they can travel faster. So that's a good example of frontal cross-sectional area. The final factor is the smoothness of a surface. If we make an object smoother in terms of surface characteristics, we can reduce air resistance. Again, good examples. 100-metre sprinters now all wear lycra. Smooth surface, reducing air resistance, making them go faster. Swimmers the same. So think about smooth surfaces speeding that person up. So these are the 4 main factors that affect air resistance and can help us to reduce air resistance. The second horizontal force is friction. Now, if you think about reaction and weight, what we said about the vertical forces, they run opposite. Friction works opposite to air resistance. So that's the first thing to have in your head. The definition of friction is it's that a force that opposes motion when 2 surfaces come together or they are in contact with each other. So if you think about rubbing your hands, 2 surfaces in contact together causes friction. We measure this in newtons, and again, when 2 bodies are in contact together, we get friction. Remember what I said about the diagram? So if we're looking at my stick diagram now of someone sprinting forwards, air resistance goes the opposite to the direction of travel from the centre of mass. Friction, therefore, has to be the opposite. So friction goes forwards, or it goes with the direction that you are going in, but this time you draw the line from the point of contact on the floor. So you can clearly see on my stick diagram the stick man's foot is on the floor, so I draw the friction line from the foot going with the direction of travel. So if he's sprinting that way, it will go with that way. Just like air resistance, there are factors that can affect friction, or things we can do to reduce friction. So again, we'll go from left to right, so starting with the red box. The roughness of the ground surface. Now, if I have a game of football this afternoon and I go and play on an AstroTurf pitch, that's a very rough contact surface. That increases friction, and therefore I can get good grip and go forwards and accelerate. So I've increased friction there. However, if I'm an ice skater and I stand on an icy surface, that reduces friction, so I'm less likely to go forward. If I trod on that ice in trainers, I'd be slipping and sliding all over the place. So that's reducing friction. So that's what we mean about the ground surface. The purple box suggests the roughness of the contact surface. So this time we're looking at the footwear that you are wearing. So again, if we go back to playing football or even rugby, I might wear a studded pair of football boots or rugby boots. This will increase friction with the ground because it will dig in to the ground and allow me to travel forwards. However, if I'm wearing a pair of trainers on a wet grassy pitch, there's no friction there or very little, and so therefore you're slowing yourself down. Friction won't be generated. This is also the reason why athletes wear spikes on tracks to increase friction so they can accelerate faster. The third box in blue says temperature. The hotter an object is, or the body is, the more increased friction we will get. Now, a good example of that is in Formula 1. If you ever watch a Formula 1 event, before they start the race, the cars will do a number of warm-up laps. And the purpose of doing that is to warm up the tyres, make them very hot. And that increases the grip of that tyre onto the hard tarmac surface, and therefore we are increasing friction. They're more likely to grip to the road we can accelerate faster and become more efficient at turning. And the final factor in the green box is what we call the size of normal reaction. A heavier object will put a greater amount of reaction, remember that line going down from the stickman, will put a greater amount of reaction into the ground. By doing that, it's going to create more friction. So if you think about a heavy object placed hard into the ground and then you roll it, it creates more friction. So we call that the size of normal reaction. A good example of that is like a shot putter. So a larger muscle mass shot putter is going to create more ground reaction because they've got more weight into the ground, and therefore that can be used to accelerate a shot put away. Okay, so again, looking at length of lines, so we did this with the vertical forces, this is the same for the horizontal forces. Please make sure you draw all these diagrams on this screencast, they'll be really useful for you. If I want my stickman to be seen to be accelerating or going fast forwards, the friction line along the bottom must be longer than the air resistance line. So because the friction line is longer than the air resistance line, it tells me the stickman is travelling forwards fast. And therefore, I would write friction is greater than air resistance. If I wanted the stickman to be slowing down, my friction line would be less than the air resistance line. So the air resistance line might be longer this time, and I might write air resistance is greater than friction by the side of it if I wanted them to decelerate. Because remember, you're drawing a static picture for the examiner, and therefore you've got to tell them what's going on. As I said earlier on, you may get a question that says to you, please draw a basketballer jumping up using only vertical forces, and therefore you only need to draw weight and reaction in a stickman diagram with the correct lines. There's 2 marks right there. If the question therefore asks you for the horizontal forces, you only draw friction and air resistance. So again, the question might say, please draw a sprinter coming out of the blocks using only horizontal forces. And my diagram there shows you the sprinter coming out of the blocks, accelerating forwards using only horizontal forces. However, the majority of free body diagrams, so we call these diagrams free body diagrams, that's just the person or an object, will ask you for all the forces on the same diagram. So you need to be able to do this. So you can now clearly see I've now put every single force that we've discussed on the one diagram. So just to recap, weight goes from the centre of mass, the purple line, going down towards the ground with a W underneath it. Reaction, the green line, goes from the point of contact, so the foot that makes contact with the floor, going upwards with an R above it. In this picture, the sprinter is not jumping upwards, so therefore weight and reaction are the same. So he's not jumping upwards in any way, weight and reaction are the same. Air resistance goes from the centre of mass, the orange line, away from the direction of travel with an AR or air resistance at the end of that line, which leaves friction, the long blue line, from the point of contact, so from the foot touching the floor, and it goes with the direction of travel, so the same way as the person or object is moving. And so by the side of that, we would also write weight equals reaction, because the purple and the green line are the same. He's not jumping upwards, or she's not jumping upwards. But they are accelerating, so friction is greater than air resistance. The final point about these diagrams is, with every single diagram that you are asked to draw, you must draw what we call a direction of travel line. That means you must tell the examiner which way the person or the object you are drawing is actually moving. So the simplest way to do that is draw a line underneath or away from your diagram that just says DOT, and in the direction you want that diagram to be seen as moving. Alright, just to finish off, for your notes, have a go at practicing drawing a stickman diagram for the following two pictures. So first of all, picture 1 is an athlete decelerating after completing a race. So I'd like you to draw a stickman diagram of an athlete decelerating, doing the diagram with all forces. Okay, so that's weight, reaction, friction, air resistance. Don't forget your direction of travel line, and don't forget your equations by the side. And the final picture, this one a little bit trickier, but you've got to think about it. A weightlifter who is lifting a very heavy weight. So at the point of the picture, nice stickman drawing please, showing weight, reaction, air resistance and friction. Again, a small direction of travel as you need it. Thanks for watching the screencast. Sorry it's a little bit longer than usual, but important stuff to cover. Again, if you need any more help on biomechanics or any other concept of OCR A-level PE, please head to the iSpeakpe channel on YouTube. I'll see you next time.